and then we're going to have a little bit of time for Q&A and discussion. So, if America can put a man on the moon, why can't we put a man on the moon? We've made, since Apollo, 3 major attempts nationally in the last 40 or so years, 45 years, to recreate the magic of Apollo. And they've all failed. They weren't even close, they just collapsed. And we had this old paradigm in our head about how we could send humans to deep space, and they were fabulously unaffordable. And if those who have looked into it, is that Apollo was a unique circumstance. It was an extension of the Cold War. And unless you get something like that, again, you're never going to recreate the magic of Apollo where that much of the federal budget goes towards space. However, there is another way. That's what we're going to get to. So we looked at had a research question. This was a study looking at fundamental research. What if we leverage commercial partnerships for sending humans to deep space? Is it technically feasible, and what would it cost? And you assume you do it smart. So you can design your own Mars architecture there. Assume it's smart. And there's some smart people here with new ways. And then you also leverage commercial partnerships and leverage commercial architectures and commercial systems that are being developed. This will give you some thoughts about what you could do with Mars. And it goes directly to the theme of this conference, Mars in our lifetime. So this study backs up, provides additional evidence that you can do Mars a lot cheaper and a lot sooner than most people conventionally think. However, you have to do it differently than the traditional approach. This is not news to Bob Zubrin. He's been talking about doing it differently for years, but I'm hoping to provide you additional hard evidence and analysis that you can do it differently and have great benefit. So our study team was all former NASA people. I'm really a serial entrepreneur, a commercial space guy, but I spent 3 years at NASA headquarters as senior advisor for commercial space. I had Dr. Alan Wilhite, who was my co-principal investigator, led the technical analysis. He set up the systems analysis branch at Langley that now does all the deep space systems analysis for NASA, including the Mars architectures. Had Edgar Zapata, who actually works at NASA. He's a life cycle cost expert, and he has all access to all the data. And he's in most cases does independent reviews of NASA's costing models, and so he's a big skeptic about many of these things, but he's an expert in these areas of costing. Had David Chevron, who's an expert in safety and mission assurance. He has about nearly 40 years industry expertise, including 19 years at NASA Johnson Space Center. Rob Kelso is an expert in lunar robotics. He recently retired from NASA too, as did Chevron. And he's led NASA's commercial lunar robotics activities before he retired. And you had Dr. Howard McCurdy from the American University, who's an expert in space policy. We had an independent review team after we designed the architecture to look this over, led by Joe Rothenberg, former NASA head of human spaceflight. We had 4 retired NASA astronauts. Jeffrey Hoffman is a professor of aeronautics at MIT. He was while he was an astronaut at the astronaut office, he was the lead for safety and mission assurance there. And then a variety of former NASA senior human spaceflight people and engineers and space policy professionals who were basically looking over our shoulders and saying, did you get anything wrong? Is there a showstopper? Did you miss something? So the architecture we evaluated was 3 phases going to the moon. And it had a very focused industrial purpose, which is to mine the water in the poles to produce propellant to enable lower cost missions to Mars, to take them off the poles and put them into lunar orbit, in our case L2, and available there to do a mission to Mars. And since we did this for NASA, we are focused on supporting the NASA DRA-5 mission to Mars architecture, which needs 200 metric tons of propellant a year. So we treated it like this is a business. Our customer wants 200 metric tons of propellant a year. What would it cost to get there step by step in a smart, low risk, incremental way? So phase 1 was getting humans back to the surface, getting the key systems developed incrementally at the equators. Phase 2 was one small step beyond that. You had in-space propellant storage and transfer in low Earth orbit. When that's available, you take the same systems to the poles. And we were leveraging here, we were taking the SpaceX Dragon, which has the ability to come back from lunar velocities, as well as CST-100, and a small incremental upgrade. And for the Boeing CST-100, we match it with the Atlas V Vulcan, the Vulcan United Alliance vehicle that they're investing in developing. And for the SpaceX version of Dragon, we were using the Falcon 9, and then eventually the Falcon Heavy, and eventually maybe the Falcon 9R, which is an easy incremental step of reusability. After phase 2, we are in parallel developing the technology to mine the moon, robotics mostly, but you're going to need a reusable lunar lander to use the water and the propellant you produce on the moon. And when you get that, you get a large reusable lunar lander that can go to L2 and back and take propellant there to the depot. That's the architecture. And when you get that reusable lunar lander, you get into phase 3. That was the key architecture we studied. There's plenty of people with other ideas, but this is just what we studied. We weren't saying this is the way to do it, even for those who go to the moon. There's other people who want to do different things. And we're not saying you go to the moon, you could go to Mars too. So, but what we were leveraging Earth orbit rendezvous and propellant storage and transfer. And on all these commercial systems. And we are incrementally developing reusable elements step by step. We're not invoking full reusability. And we actually assumed over a couple of decades we don't develop full reusability, which would change everything. And we assessed 2 different technical approaches. So, to the summary of the conclusions. So we did a bottoms-up, element by element, phase approach of all the technology and the systems we need to do, and then we costed each of the things, and then we laid them out within a fixed budget of $2.8 billion a year. That was our cost constraint, $2.8 billion a year. And what came out is we could put humans back on the moon in phase 1, 5 to 7 years from authority to proceed. Money turns on. And this assumes that the government doesn't mess it up, like every year slows it down or causes problems, which is not necessarily a good assumption. But it could be done in 5 to 7 years for $10 billion for 2 systems. That's about $5 billion each, plus or minus 30%. So within the next presidential administration, you could have that president say, I'm going to put humans on the moon, and that could happen potentially by the end of their second term. We did not estimate, so I want to contrast this that I was telling you. The Constellation program, which was not that long ago, if you add up all the money to the first footprints on the moon, was $120 billion in current day dollars. That's the contrast. We did not estimate the cost for a single provider because our hard data for the partnerships is always under competition. Always 2 providers. So for commercial cargo and COTS and commercial crew, in all cases, we were using that data as anchor points for this estimate. It was always under competition. So our assumption is $10 billion for 2. If you do 1, it might be $9 billion. So competition is critical for many reasons. You get some cost savings on the margin, but it's actually really critical for risk reduction and redundancy. We've recently seen how critical redundancy is at the space station. You lose a cargo provider, there's another one there, you don't shut down the space station. Same thing will go for the moon and Mars. Redundancy is going to be a critical thing. And also, we looked at getting the first footprints on the moon and then getting 5 more missions for a single provider. You're looking at about $12 billion. As compared to Apollo, and Apollo had a lot more going. It had to start from nothing. Okay, in our case, we have a lot of technology and these systems we can leverage. It was about $12 billion to reproduce what Apollo did, which is 6 missions to the moon, 6 sorties to the moon. So phase 3, we get to a permanent lunar base. When you get the lunar lander, it turns out that we can afford, under that fixed $2.8 billion, a permanent lunar base with 4 astronauts having 6-month tours to the moon, coming back, and another 4 going. Okay, so twice a year, human missions to the moon, 4 cargo delivery missions a year, and you can do that within the $2.8 billion. And the key economic phase shift here is when you get that reusable lunar lander with propellant, ISRU is critical. It really shows up in the analysis that you could go from sorties to a permanent lunar base. And that same lunar lander can put down the large habitats. So you could do the same thing on Mars. So that reusable lunar Mars lander will be a critical enabler for much more affordable Mars settlements. It was here in a lunar lander. It showed up. And it also allowed that same lunar lander that could put down large elements on the moon could deliver 200 metric tons of propellant a year. So this is the hardest technical thing in the whole architecture, but this is in phase 3. You don't get into phase 3 until you do this, and you're working on the technologies to get there. So it's deferred so you can work on it. You do this. So the key message here is you could have a permanent lunar base all within NASA's existing deep space human spaceflight budget. And the total estimated costs, you're constrained by speed by the budget. If you add it all up, it's about $40 billion to get to that permanent base from start. So plus or minus 30%. And this all assumes one other thing, because you want skin in the game and a real partnership with industry, but this is too risky for industry to put skin in the game because NASA is not a good customer. I'll give you a little secret. And you don't know, and it's not NASA's fault. One NASA administrator could cut a deal and sign a contract in 4 years or 8 years, they're guaranteed to be gone, and the next president comes in and says, I don't care about this. And they can't bind them to that. So how do you, as a commercial investor, decide that's not too risky? Well, one way we looked at is a Port Authority model, like CERN, and so there's a lot of details in the study if you're interested in this. You could do something like this on Mars as well. We looked at an international lunar authority that brought in the international partners, but functioned like a commercial entity. If you think about the Dulles, they got an airport authority. If you get a contract from an airport authority, you can take that to the bank and you know that's a good contract and you're going to get paid. That's worth investing in. So if you had an authority like CERN, CERN has the same aspects. If you got a contract from CERN, that is a bankable, investable contract, and you can trust that they're not going to be canceled soon. CERN is extremely stable. It's now the world's leading high-energy research institution. It's vastly surpassed the US version of that, which collapsed under the superconducting supercollider, which has many things in parallel and similarity with the way we do deep space exploration. The U.S. Congress decided it was too unaffordable, but an international partnership locked in treaty was very stable, and it operates much like a large commercial company with best practices. So, some other implications. We assume this would be privately owned and operated, that you're using a partnership like cargo. SpaceX owns and operates the Dragon and the Falcon 9. So this would be a privately owned and operated lunar base. You can sell other missions to other countries as well to private investors. So the marginal cost of putting another person to the moon, you could sell it to South Korea, Japan. There's 200 countries in phase 1 and 2 with assuming only one passenger, paying the whole cost of the whole marginal cost of another trip was 600 to 700 million. In phase 2, when you get the larger lunar lander, and this will be true if you get the larger lunar lander earlier, is where you have 3 passengers, you're looking at $150 to $200 million per round trip. Right now, there are 2 people who have signed up to buy a trip from Space Adventures just to go around the moon. There will be a lot more people who would sign up to take a trip to actually walks on the moon for a week or 2 and then comes home. There's over 1,000 billionaires in this country and around the world, and there's nearly 200 countries, only one of which has put humans on the moon, citizens of their country. Each and every one of them would love to have their first citizen of their country that visited the moon. They're all customers for a commercially owned and operated system. So, implications for Mars. So there's two types of implications. I think the second type you'll probably be more interested in, but I want to mention this first, is if you have a commercial lunar base that produces low-cost propellant and puts it in an L2 depot, that 80% of the propellant going to Mars, that will vastly reduce the number of expensive Earth launches that you would need to do, and then you can top off at the L2 depot and go to Mars. So it will make it less operationally complex. If you like the SLS and you like that architecture, the current 10 to 12 launches you need to do for DRA-5 using chemical propulsion reduces to 3 using in-space propellant transfer. That makes actually SLS much more technically realistic and operationally and conceivably feasible. And at the same time, if Mars is a customer of the moon, this is not either or. The lunar advocates are going to be the biggest cheerleaders for going to Mars because Mars is the customer. So it actually aligns interests here strategically in this case. This is a unique case where the lunar people really want everybody to go to Mars, because the more people go to Mars, the more customers they have. So this could substantially pay for the costs of the lunar base, operationally year in and year out. The other conclusions, which I was hinting at, you can use a similar approach to going to Mars. We could actually transform how we go to Mars, and Bob has talked about some of these things, but this analysis backs it up. That if you did something similar to this, it's the key to designing a much cheaper approach to Mars. You leverage commercial systems that exist or are in development to the maximum extent possible. You use funded Space Act agreements to the maximum extent possible for other developments. They're 8 to 10 times cheaper than a traditional cost approach. If you look at the analysis of SpaceHab versus the traditional approach, and SpaceX with the Dragon and the Falcon 1 and Falcon 9 versus the traditional approach, they were about a factor of 8 cheaper using a COTS-like partnership approach. And you buy services to the extent possible, not hardware. So you can have, I think, I'm skeptical about a decade, but this is not too far off if you change how you do it. And you can persuade our national leaders to change how we do it. The analysis supports it for the moon. There's no reason that we can't have the same benefits of vastly lower cost missions to Mars using a similar approach. That's the end of my presentation. I'll take questions and here, if you want to get the study report, go to ResearchGate and look up Dr. Alan Wilhite, who's his name at ResearchGate.
Okay, hi. Thanks for your talk, Charles. I like your overall approach in terms of commercial acquisition and the way you propose to organize things. I will say, though, that there's a technical error in what you're saying. The L2 depot for propellant is of very limited utility for going to Mars, because the delta V to go from low Earth orbit to L2 is almost as great as that to go to Mars. In other words, you're not supplying all the propellant needed to go to Mars from LEO.
So I agree with that.
You're supplying only a small fraction of it. So if you wanted to make a business out of lunar oxygen, you have to transport it to LEO, not to L2. The L2 depots make no sense.
Well, I'd like to see the analysis, Bob. I wasn't saying that all of the propellant you need to go to Mars, you do from the depot. In fact, you would launch, some people propose taking the propellant down from the lunar orbit down to LEO. I just think that makes no sense. You would launch it from a Falcon Heavy. right? So, or something else. So
Well,
I'll have to go. Alan Wheelwright looked at this. He didn't think it was as harsh as you were suggesting.
No. To go to L2 from Leo takes a delta V of about 3.4 kilometers a second. To go to Mars from Leo takes a delta V of 3.8 kilometers a second. You're saving 400 meters a second out of, you're saving 1/8, 12% of the delta V. It makes no sense. Now,
however, now that's a good point. Let me answer where it does make sense. When you take your Mars transfer vehicle to Mars and bring it back, do you bring it all the way down in the gravity well or throw it away? Or do you just rendezvous at L2, stay high in the gravity well, refill up again, and go again?
Well, wait a second. Who's going to go again? They have to go to L2.
Coming back from Mars. Assuming you want...
Well, if you're going to go from Mars to L2 and then go back to Mars, why not just stay on Mars? I mean, if you want to send somebody else to Mars, they would have to go to L2. Okay.
Oh, so you're not bringing the people back?
No. If you bring the people back, they want to go back to Earth, not to L2. Okay.
I understand. But it's easy to take the humans from L2 and bring them down and refill up the Mars transfer vehicle at L2 using the propellant that's there. You only bring back the humans back from L2.
No. You need the only place where it makes sense to have a propellant depot, other than the surface of Mars, okay, where we can make on Mars, yes, okay, is, in other words, from Leo. So you could potentially transfer propellant from the moon to Leo, and with the marginal delta V by aerobraking. But that's
no, I wouldn't do that.
No, but if you put your propellant at L2, it's of no utility for Mars missions, because you're spending almost as much propellant to go to L2 as you would to go to Mars.
Let me explain it again. I don't think you got what I was saying. Let me say it again. I agree that there's minimal utility on the first mission. You build the Mars transfer vehicle in low Earth orbit, whatever you build, and you can go to Mars on the first one. Fine. But are you going to throw that Mars transfer vehicle away and have them come all the way back to low Earth orbit? You could do that. Or come all the way back to low Earth orbit and fill up again from low Earth orbit and go. Or you can come back to the L2 depot, fill up, and go again. You don't come back all the way down in Earth's gravity well, is what I'm saying.
Well, the astronauts do need to come back into Earth's gravity well.
You have, Bob, you swap out the astronauts at L2.
Is it okay if we take another question and we continue that discussion offline? Thank you.
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. I note that one of the assumptions that you've made is that the lunar base itself is a commercially operated, if not commercially owned base. Mm-hmm. And I have two questions about that. First of all, how much do you estimate that a base like that would cost to construct and then to maintain? What I'm seeing is that there might be $3 billion worth of gross sales of propellant coming out of that base, but there are going to be significant operating costs and a significant capital investment. Who's going to build it, and how much will it cost them?
So that was I reported on that. It's over that period, and constrained in a $2.8 billion budget, it cost to get the permanent crewed base about $40 billion.
Okay.
And that's having a bunch of sortie missions and operational missions building up to that over about 12 to 15 years. And the operational budget is assumed to be about $2.83 billion a year for keeping a permanent base there. That was what I'm sorry I miscommunicated. That's what it costs. I'm not saying you're getting all of that covered by selling propellant. Propellant there's going to be a market price of depending on the value. Okay, it may be $1 billion, it may be $2 billion, it'll be what. There's going to be alternative forms of propellant. We're going to create a propellant economy in space. You're going to have depots in the low Earth orbit too.
Okay,
so.
I'll get you after the presentation.
Okay. This is a 100-page study, so a lot of this, I encourage you, if you're interested in learning more, go look at the study.
Yeah. Did you look at the cost of, while setting up the lunar base, whenever a easy access to Mars orbit comes up, of instead of putting the facility on the moon, you'd put a facility on Mars to sort of build everything out?
This was a $100,000 study. We didn't have the chance to study alternative. We had to pick one and look at that. So that's why it's a limited study about contrasting different acquisition approaches. So we didn't look at lots of different trades and alternatives. We didn't look at anything specific to Mars.
Hello, Mr. Miller. Oscar Matthews. I was wondering, first of all, thank you for supporting space exploration, even if it is to the moon. I support the alternative, but...
Well, I want to be clear, I'm an all of the above guy.
Exactly.
I want to open up the solar system to human civilization. And Mars is a huge part of that. Okay.
I agree. And I also support the idea that the technology that you require to execute your plan is feasible. How do you address, which I'm sure you have critiques and people who you must convince for your mission plan, how do you convince people that your plan is feasible before you actually execute it? So if you don't actually have the ability to create fuel on the moon, how do you prove it without actually having the hardware by the normal definition of a plan?
So, first of all, you hire the best and brightest technical people to do the analysis, and you answer all, attacks on it technically with real engineers. Second, you acknowledge the key risks, you prioritize them, and you develop a plan to buy down the risks that makes sense. So, strategically, a key risk for us is maybe the water on the poles that they discovered is actually really deep. We don't know how deep it is or in what form it is, so you need to eliminate that risk before you go to set up a base and find out it's really deep and inaccessible. So there's risks here. And then you have a phase buy-off technical risk, like we suggest is these multiple phases. So, and we put together a team with, we thought, the sufficient expertise to persuade people that we are answering many that this is technically feasible.
Sir, just a follow-up. So what if the critique is that it's not feasible because you actually haven't tested on the moon yet, but in theory that it should work? Then
well, at some point we just have to decide to have some leaders and say we can do this, we have the ability. Think about what John F. JFK would have said to that critique. He said, we're going to go do this, right? And you need a leader who says, we're going to go do this, and has enough analysis and backup to back it up. So, you can't, if everybody, you need to know your stuff, and you need to have some commitment and some vision.
I'd like to thank everyone for these excellent conversations. Please feel free to continue them after the talk. We're going to break for lunch. Thank you so very much, sir.